We go. So we started the book of Romans, and we've been talking about Paul as a Roman and Paul as a Jew. And we left off at the end of 17, and then we're going to dive into the beginning of the book. So many people think that the thesis statement of the book is right here. So I'll just read at verse 14. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are also in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For it is the righteousness for in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. And the righteous will live by faith, the NIV says. And we went into all of this, and so if you're curious about this, you can go back and watch the old videos. But before we get into the rest, I want us to review what Paul means by the gospel. And there we looked at, over the course of looking in the book of Acts, every time Paul went into a synagogue in a Gentile city, there were 3 points that his sermons always made. And those 3 points are sort of a good way to understand what does he mean by the gospel. Anybody remember what those 3 points were? Okay, Jesus is Messiah. Okay, Jesus is Lord. That's basically what it means by reigns from heaven. And what? Right. Jesus resurrected. So those 3 points. And usually he starts with this one. Jesus raised from the dead. He is Messiah. And the ascendant Jesus is Lord. That's what he comes to again and again and again and again. That's really, in many ways, the beginning of his theology. So if you remember the story of Paul, he's persecuting the church. He's on the road to Damascus. Jesus appears to him in the sky. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you? I'm Jesus. And then Paul spends 14 years trying to get his head around this. And what we sort of mapped out in the book of Acts was he finally is called by Barnabas to go to Antioch because there's a whole group of Gentiles who are identifying as Christians and they need training and teaching. So Barnabas brings Paul to Antioch. The church at Antioch, after some time together with Barnabas and Paul, decide to send Barnabas and Paul to other cities in the region, first Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, and then later on into Greece, to do there what he did in Antioch. And in this way, this new church is born. Now, Paul is writing to the Romans, but he's never been to Rome as a Christian. He's never visited the Roman church, but he understands something about Rome that is key to his mission. What is special about Rome, especially with respect to how does it relate to Jerusalem, let's say? Okay. According to the story of the Old Testament, who should rule the world? The Jews. Jerusalem should rule the world. The situation is that Rome rules the world. And the question that Paul has to wrestle with is, why the difference? This is the question that the Jews are wrestling with. This is not very different from, if anybody remembers Osama bin Laden, part of what the Islamists were frustrated with is that they should be ruling the world. And in the eyes of the Islamists, who is ruling the world? Washington and New York. Where were those 9/11 attacks? Washington and New York. They didn't attack random buildings. They attacked the World Trade Center. They attacked the Pentagon, and they intended to attack the White House. But the plane heading to the White House crashed in Pennsylvania when those on the airplane were able to at least disrupt the hijack and crash the plane into a field. So this tension isn't completely gone from us, because there's always a ruler of the world, or at least a ruler of our world. And the question is, well, why isn't it Jesus? Because, well, these are sort of the 3 points of his gospel. Jesus is Messiah, and as we talk about at the 11 o'clock service often, a big piece of Jesus' ministry is to recalibrate the assumption of what Messiah means. Because again, when Jesus rose to fame in the Galilee and in Judea, what were the expectations of him? That he would clean the Romans out of the promised land, clean the Romans out of the Holy Land, free God's holy people from Roman oppression. And then the hopes would be that he wouldn't stop just with Jerusalem. Once Jerusalem became the preeminent city of Judea and Galilee, quickly it would become the preeminent city of Samaria. And then from there on, it would go out into all the world. And Jerusalem would supplant Rome, sort of in the way that Rome supplanted Babylon or Alexandria or any of the other capitals or Athens, any of the capitals that were around, that Jesus would rule over his kingdom from Jerusalem. Now, Islam pretty much grabbed that script too, didn't they? Muhammad went out and conquered, and Medina and Mecca and the great cities of Islam would rule the world. And for centuries, that was the game that Islam played. But Jesus does not take up that script. Jesus takes up a different script. What is the script that Jesus takes up? Okay, he's there for everybody. He conquers the Romans not by making them dead, but by making them alive in him, which is why Paul eagerly wants to go to Rome, because he wants to participate in making Rome alive in Jesus Christ. That's what Paul is trying to do. He is trying to further the conquest of Jesus. And again, this is a completely different understanding of conquest. Because, of course, everyone assumed, the Jews, later Muhammad, everyone assumed that the way to conquer the world is with, well, your army and your ideas, because the Romans certainly tried to include the world in the Roman way. The Romans believed that they knew how to run the world, but they also had their legions backing it up. During World War II, Hitler asked, how many tanks does the Pope have? Hitler did not understand the messianic nature of Jesus' kingdom. The Pope had no tanks. Well, popes are still around. The Third Reich is not. This is key to understanding Jesus. Okay, now we're going to get into this next section, which is, now the handouts, there's a 13-page handout I gave you. And there's also a little 2-page handout too. The 13-page handout is the rest of Romans chapter 1 in 5 translations, okay? That's why it's 13 pages. It's all parallel. And you can keep that because we'll be using it for a number of weeks because we're going to take some time in this. But today we want to sort of rush through these verses and try to get a sense of it before we start digging into the particulars and the details. So here at 1 verse 18, many believe, at least who are reading the book today, that we're starting into the meat of the book of Romans. And Paul is going to go back and in some ways try to explain the story of the world in light of Christ. So Romans 1 verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all impiety and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what can be known about God is evident among them, for God made it clear to them. For from the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and deity, are discerned clearly, being understood in the things created, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasoning, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of immortal God with the likeness of an image of mortal human beings, birds, quadrupeds, and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the desires of their hearts to immorality, that their bodies would be dishonored among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God with a lie, and worshiped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed for eternity. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their females exchanged the natural relations for those contrary to nature, and likewise also the males, abandoning natural relations with the female, were inflamed in their desire towards one another, males with males committing the shameless deed, and receiving in themselves the penalty that was necessary for their error. And as they did not see fit to recognize God, God gave them over to debased minds to do the things that are not proper. Being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, and greediness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malevolence, they are gossipers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant boasters, contrivers of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, faithless, unfeeling, unmerciful, who, although they know the requirements of God, that those who do such things are worthy of death, not only do they do the same things, but they approve of them. They approve of those who do them. Okay, so what I have in this sheet for you is chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, because you have to read all these chapters together to understand the flow of Paul's argument. What we're going to see is in chapters, so we've had the introduction, which is chapters 1, verses 1 through 17. That's the intro. And the next section is chapters 1, 18 to all the way to the end of chapter 3. And in there, we have a treatment of the pagan world, a treatment of the Jewish story, and then the whole world. So it's basically pagan world plus Jewish story equals whole world. Now, this is really key because in the last round of classes we asked the question, what is the book of Romans about? Paul, again, is both Jew and Roman. And what he does in this book are to try to bring these two worlds together, make the Jewish world intelligible to the Roman world, and apply the history of the Jews into the history of the rest of the world. And that's part of why this book is so key. And it's part of why Christianity has been so powerful throughout the history of the world after it conquered Rome. Because basically what Christianity has tried to do is run a different kind of empire than the world usually runs. Now, since Christianity has done this, others have sort of picked up Christianity and looked how we've done it. But this has been the main difference between Christianity and, let's say, the Davidic kingdom in the Old Testament, the Islamic kingdom, which would rise in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, and the Roman kingdom, the Assyrian kingdom, the Persian kingdom, that Christianity attempts to conquer not by killing, but in many ways, but by, as Paul will say later, the renewal of our minds. Because if the mind is renewed, the body will follow. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara. We're going to get there. Because the way to conquer, a lot of time on the internet, people ask, repeat the question. Does this mean love your brothers? Because it's hard for them to hear you guys. Does this mean love your brothers? Yes. Because what this does is it says, love is the way that you conquer. Remember, when Jesus is arrested in the garden, he says something very famous about the sword. What does he say? He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So during the week when I'm talking on the internet about a bunch of these things, one of the clips I often play is by a non-theist Canadian cognitive scientist who has this series of lectures, but in one lecture he talks about agape. And it's a really lovely clip because what he notes is that agape, which is this self-giving, self-sacrificial love, is actually the engine that brings us into personhood to begin with. And I'm the only man in this room right now. We have 4 women, and I know all 4 of you women, and I know all 4 of you women have our mothers. Carmen had 5. Carol had 3 sons. Edie had 3 daughters. How many? I know only one of your sons. You had 2. A son and a daughter. So we're even here in terms of boys and girls. You have Carmen, that's right. Carmen had 4 boys. So we got more boys than girls. Carmen had 4 boys and 1 daughter. So this cognitive scientist makes the point, is exactly right, that when you gave birth to your child, sometimes we talk in the abortion debates about viability, as if a newborn infant is viable. A newborn infant is not viable. The newborn infant is completely dependent on his or her mother. And the point that this cognitive scientist was making is that it is agapic love that parents pour into their children and turn them into adults. And you all know this. This baby comes home. This baby needs to nurse. But the baby doesn't just need food. I mean, Edie will tell you, she majors in this stuff. The baby needs contact with its mother. The baby needs eye contact. The baby needs to have the mother talk to the baby. A big question in psychology was, how do people learn to talk? It's an amazing thing. You can find somebody with low IQ, but you know what they're able to do? They're able to speak. A chimp can't speak. A dolphin can't speak, not like us. Children, even mentally disabled children, learn to talk. How do they talk? And so this Russian scientist studied this and said, you know what? Parents automatically reduce their language to a level just a little above the baby. And the parent slowly teaches that child how to talk. Because first, of course, the kid comes out and they can't even make eye contact. And then Oh, then there's mom. Nursing, right up there, eye contact. And the baby learns eye contact from the mom. And then the mom is talking to the baby. Da, 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 da. Words start to come out. And then the baby smiles. And everybody comes around. He's looking at me and smiling. And we smile back. And bit by bit by bit, years of attention, sacrifice, turn that little creature into a human being. That's the power of agape. And so what Jesus will do, what Christianity will do, is say, it works the same way between us and our Heavenly Father. Through his Son, he begins to turn us into sons and daughters, just like all of you mothers turned these helpless little infants into human beings. Now, then that's how Christianity conquers. But before we get that, Paul is going to take a step back and say, well, we have to ask the question, and sometimes I call this the great puzzle. Anybody remember what I mean by the great puzzle? Let's talk about this world. Let me ask you, is this world a world of suffering and strife? Yes. What do I mean? Well, I can just look around this room. Edie sits in a little room, often with people who have suffered trauma. They've suffered trauma in war. They've suffered trauma at the hands of strangers. And some of the most difficult trauma of all to heal, trauma suffered at the hands of the people who should have blessed them. It's the most difficult trauma to deal with at all. So this world is a world full of pain and strife. I call it the Age of Decay. Now, all of us in this room are getting older. When I came here, I had hair. I did. 25 years ago, I had hair. Over time, well, the pounds go on, the blood pressure goes up, the cholesterol goes up, parts of our body start breaking down. I can't remember like I used to remember. I can't see like I used to see. I can't hear like I used to hear. My whole body breaks down. And it gets harder and harder and harder and harder. And those little babies you brought into the world, guess what? The world had their way with those little babies. And they get lost sometimes. And they don't treat their spouses or their children or their parents as they should. And sometimes it's drugs. Sometimes it's all kinds of other things. This world is a world of struggle and strife. And in the end, it wears us all down. It breaks down our relationships. It breaks down the fruit of our effort. And there's misery. That's one fact about the world. What's another fact about the world? No, it doesn't stop for us to heal. Struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle, and the world will win. You will not beat the Age of Decay. You will not do it. You can resist it for a while, but it wins. The other thing about this world is that this is a world of glory. It's a world of immense glory. Every year, people travel from all over the world just to go to a valley in the Sierra. They spent thousands of dollars flying from Asia, from Europe, and they land in San Francisco or Sacramento, and they rent an RV or they get on a bus and they drive into Yosemite Valley and they get off and they say, it's granite, it's water, it's trees, there's some wildlife. There's rock and dirt and trees and wildlife all over the world. What's with Yosemite? There's glory there. And when you bring that little baby into the world and that little baby first makes eye contact and first smiles, the whole world shines. And so the great puzzle is this question: how can this be a world of both strife and glory? It just is. And we can't see the two things at the same time. And so we want to know what is wrong with the world and can it be set right? Here's an even stranger aspect of this. The only world you have ever known is one of strife. Before you were able to form narrative memories in your mind, you were there in a soft, warm space. It was kind of confined, but it was always the right temperature. And you heard these sounds that began to code your vocal range. And everything was wonderful. And well, it was a little restrictive, but you didn't even know you were upside down. And then everything starts to move and it's squeezing, and then your head sticks out. And you can barely see out these eyes, and everything's blurry, and then flop, you're out, and it's cold and it's free, and someone smacks you. What a welcome. This is the only world you've ever known. Yet something in you says, this world should not be this place of decay, of aging, of getting lost, of wandering. So how do we navigate? How do we understand? How do we make sense of these two worlds?
People ask, if God is real and he's God of love, why is there so much pain and suffering?
Exactly. Now, over the centuries, there were lots of answers to this question given. One solution was the two God solution. Any guesses what involved in that? There's a good God, and there was an evil God. So maybe that's how, and the world is basically fighting between a good God and an evil God. The contemporary solution to this that is dominant in our culture is the world is fundamentally chaos and without order, and any order we see or realize is a projection of our own wishes out onto the world. And the difference between the glory and the strife is that the strife is real chaos, and the glory is just a projection that we place onto the world. Is that a satisfying answer? Why not? No, it doesn't, does it? It says basically, well, the best you can do is lean into the projection and the illusion. Okay, well, how can I do that? You want to know one of the easiest ways to lean into the projection and the illusion and escape the strife and the suffering? Disassociate. Edie sits off with all trauma victims. This isn't happening to me. I'm separate from my body. There's lots of ways we actually disassociate and distract. Our streets are lined with people who are doing it. What's one way to do it? Drugs. Drugs are a great way because drugs are so powerful. They hijack the chemistry of our mind. You shoot up heroin and bliss. You do meth, you have power, you have excitement. You know, drugs go one way. They bring you up or they bring you down. It's one way or the other. And so then when you do a bunch of up, it's like, I can't take being up anymore. So then you do drugs to take you down. I mean, and you don't even have to go all the way to meth and heroin. You can have caffeine and wine. You know, at night, I just can't relax. Wine, 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 wine. In the morning, I can't get up. Coffee, 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 coffee. This is what we do. And we do it in subtle ways. We do it in big ways. Sit on the couch and watch Netflix. I mean, one way or another, the world is crazy. I need to go into my happy place, but I know that my happy place is not the real world, and it can only be sustained by my money and power and my ability to bring to me the things that create this little cocoon, and the rest of the world can go away. That can be a romantic relationship. You know, you and me are lost in love and the world disappears. I mean, we've got thousands of ways we do this. But, and many of those ways are not bad things. But if you believe that the world is just accident and chaos, what do you have left? This is what you have left. So Paul wants to tell a different story. And the story is going to have to deal with a great puzzle. The story is going to have to deal with the way that we see the world. On one hand, it's the age of decay. And all that I poured into my children, guess what? They might be wonderful. I might love them. But the world is going to have their way with them. Is there any hope? Here's the question. Can this world be saved? And if so, how? Now, before we talked about this other question about who Jesus is. Because messiahs were all about saving the world, right? And so here is the story. Well, here's my nation. Here's my tribe. Here's my people. We're in charge of our own destiny, and we like that. And then we discover we have neighbors. And the neighbors are for themselves, and we're for ourselves. And this world isn't big enough for both of us, so let's dominate our neighbors. And if we can dominate our neighbors, we can secure for ourselves the life that we want. That's a standard messianic story. It's I win, you lose. Jesus, as Messiah, changes that story and says, I will let you kill me. And the world says, what? I will let you kill me. Okay. And so he lets them kill him. And that should be the end of his story, right? But it isn't. That's where resurrection is a really strange thing. Because what resurrection says is that the God of this world undoes the main story we try to tell. What's that main story we try to tell? It's you against me. And God says, actually, I get to write the story of the world. And I want to write a different story from what humanity has been writing. And so when Jesus arises from the dead, what that does is validate and vindicate what Jesus taught. Because a lot of what Jesus taught, most people, including his disciples, didn't really seem to comprehend very well because it sounded so strange. Yeah, that's right. It was very odd, the kinds of things that Jesus said. But then when he comes back from the dead, if Jesus were to continue the regular messianic story, Jesus could have gone to Pilate and said, can't kill me. Could have gone to Herod. Could have, well, if you have an invincible army, you can still kill your enemies. But that's not what Christians did. Christians continued to die. And it's like, well, that's not a very smart strategy. Who wins a war by dying? No, you win a war by killing. And Christians begin to win the war by dying. But they're dying in this agapic way. Now, when you had your little babies, you didn't die. My great-grandmother died giving birth to her last child. None of you died giving birth, but every time you woke up in the middle of the night, when that baby needed to nurse, a little part of you died. I'm going to surrender my sleep. I'm going to withdraw my right to sleep for the sake of this child. And every time that little child had a needed to eat, needed to get dressed, had his feelings hurt, needed help with his schoolwork, a little part of you died. You continued to embrace tiny little deaths so that child could grow. And what Jesus says and does with this is say, that pattern is actually the pattern of the world. And my disciples live in that pattern. And that's how we conquer. And so, in 300 years or so, Jesus did, in a certain way, conquer the empire. But it was Jesus' disciples that did this. So, here's the question. How does this work? And so in order to do this, Paul is going to have to talk about the pagan world. He's going to have to talk about the Jewish story, and he's going to summarize this in terms of a united whole world story. And this is in many ways what the book of Romans is about. Paul going into how the great puzzle is resolved. Any comments or questions so far? Okay. All right. Verse 18. Well, let's actually, so the other sheets I have, let's see. So that big pile is Romans chapters 1:18 to the end of chapter 3, all in 5 translations. The little 2-sheet deal is 3 translations of Romans 1 to the end by 3 individual translators. Now, we talk quite a bit in this class about translations. So one of the ways that when you buy a Bible at a bookstore or on Amazon, most of these Bibles have been translated by committees. And, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses between a committee working and an individual working?
Committee working, there's ideas coming from many directions.
Okay.
The translation comes from one direction.
Right. So when a committee puts together a project, the committee compromises, synthesizes, and basically gives a rendering of something through the process of a group. When an individual translates, there's sort of a group, but that whole group is in the individual's head. And they're doing all the weighing. And so when I first started doing this series, some people were like, oh, you're only using committee translations. You should use some individual translations. I thought, oh, that's a pretty good idea. So we've got committee translations over time, and we've got individual translations. So David Bentley Hart is an Orthodox scholar. N.T. Wright is an Anglican scholar. And Eugene Peterson is an American Presbyterian pastor. And so those are the three individual translations that I'm using. It's a little difficult to find individual translations of the whole New Testament because it's a big job. And so sort of the way publishing houses work now is that a publishing house will commission a translation and they'll basically pay for all the process work of the committee. And that's what you get from the NIV or the New Revised Standard Version or the New Living Translation, et cetera, et cetera. These individuals are scholars, and they sat down and kind of did this as a labor of love. And of course, there's a Greek text behind it, which is also in the 5 translations. But let's start with David Bentley Hart, chapter 1, verse 18. David Bentley Hart and Eugene Peterson are both Americans, and N.T. Wright is British, or the UK is splitting up too. So is he Irish or is he? I don't think he's Irish. Is he English or is he Scottish? I don't know. Having said that, now on this recording, somebody will correct me in the comment section. So, we have 4 people in the room, and when this is done, we'll have between 500 and 1,500 people go through this. So believe me, everything I get wrong, they point out. They let me know. David Bentley Hart, for God's vehemence against all the impiety and injustice of human beings. See, okay, so now we're dealing with the great puzzle here, right? God's vehemence against all the impiety and injustice of human beings, who by injustice suppress the truth, is revealed from heaven, because what is known of God is manifest among them, because God made it manifest to them. Now, one of the things that you'll notice with David Bentley Hart, and I haven't gone through and checked this yet, is he's going to try to hold the tension of the sentences between the English and the Greek, because it's often the case that the Greek has long sentences which your grammar teacher would have marked you wrong for in English. So you can see the LEB here in the 5 thing has the first sentence being 18 and 19. You can see the RSV has a sentence for verse 18 and a sentence for verse 19. The NIV tries to hold it together, and the New Living Translation will have 2 sentences. Okay. Let's go back to, let's take a look at N.T. Wright. For the anger of God is revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and injustice performed by people who use injustice to suppress the truth. Period. What can be known of God, you see, is plain to them, since God has made it plain to them. Period. Let's take a look at Eugene Peterson. But God's angry displeasure erupts as acts of human mistrust, and wrongdoing and lying accumulate as people try to put a shroud over the truth, period. But the basic reality of God is plain enough. Open your eyes. There it is. Okay. Now, I want to touch on something briefly, and I know that we got to keep our eyes on the time because after class, I got to break down all of these computers and get everything over there for the 11 o'clock service. But this question, where's the great puzzle? Is this it? Nope. This question of the great puzzle, here it is. has a lot to do with the difference between the Jewish conception of the world and the pagan conception of the world. In the pagan conception of the world, and it was in the earlier part of the 20th century, it was a Hebrew scholar who began to, let me back things up a little bit more even. In the 19th and 20th century, archaeologists began to discover a lot of ancient texts. And our knowledge of the ancient world in which Israel was submerged became a lot clearer. And in the 1930s and 1940s, a Jewish scholar named Ezekiel Kaufman looked at the Bible and compared it to a lot of the texts that we were discovering from Babylon and Assyria, with characters like Gilgamesh. And they began to notice similarities between the Hebrew Bible and some of those stories, but also some differences. And one of the things that the scholar noted was that in almost every pagan civilization, they had stories about the birth and creation of the gods. This god came from here. This god came from there. The Greeks have it. The Babylonians had it. The Persians had it. The Assyrians had it. You know what civilization has none of that in their literature? The Jews. The Bible doesn't start with, in the beginning was chaos. And then out of chaos came the Lord. No. In the beginning was God. And so what he noted was that in most pagan literature, what you have is what Ezekiel Kaufman called a metadivine realm. And in this realm, there are these little gods. And these little gods would do things like make people and make animals and make things, but these little gods were always subject to the rules of the metadivine realm. And sometimes the myths tried to personify that power in gods themselves. And so, for example, if you look at the Greeks, they have the Fates. And the gods were subject to fate. Or you had gods like Nike, who is victory, the god of victory. And so you see this tension in pagan poets and stories between the power of the metadivine realm and the power of the gods. You don't get any of that in the Hebrew stories. And there's this tension then as to, well, how do we solve the great puzzle? Well, you can kind of solve the great puzzle with this pagan story by saying, well, there are good gods and bad gods. There are gods who like you and gods who don't. There are gods who, and if you look at Greek gods, they're sort of like big, powerful human beings. Or you can look at it, try and resolve it between the tension between the metadivine realm and the gods. But the Hebrew story has God. Now, how do we understand strife and glory when there's one God and there's no tension between that God and the metadivine realm? Where does the tension come from? Now, you know it right away in the biblical story because Genesis 1, God makes the world. It's kind of a temple. Genesis 2, humanity is placed in the garden of the temple. If you had a palace in the ancient world, you'd have a garden with it. You can go to the Palace of Versailles outside of France, and then there's the famous Gardens of Versailles. And so the man and the woman are gardeners in the palace garden, but then something happens. What happens in the garden? Rebellion. Now, we're gonna take a much closer look at this next week, but one of the things that we begin with talking about, David Bentley Hart calls it vehemence. I don't know. N.T. Wright says anger. The text you saw before was wrath. Wrath and anger, they're sort of close. There's something I like about Eugene Peterson's, but God's angry displeasure, that's sort of what he's dealing with in terms of wrath, erupts as acts of human mistrust. So Paul's going to get into this idea that rebellion has within it its own punishment. Think about, I got to wrap this up. You got a little spill over there? Big spill. Oh. If your child rebels against you, now most of you know, what do you want for your child? The best. But you as an adult the child is like, I want to watch TV all night and only eat ice cream. No, you have a bedtime. I will give you ice cream after you eat your vegetables. The child says, why are you so mean? And you say, I'm not being mean. If you watch TV all the time and eat only ice cream, there are going to be consequences for this. And I, as an adult, fully understand what this means. Maybe you've tried it. Maybe you know friends who live this way. And so you tell your child, out of love, I am not going to allow you to do this. But maybe they rebel further. And so Paul begins the story of the pagan world with rebellion. He's going to begin the story of the Jewish world with the law. But then they have the question, did the law resolve the problem for the Jewish world? No, because they couldn't live by the law. Then you're getting into chapter 3. Oh, all have fallen short of the glory of God, pagan or Jewish, either with the law or in only having the law revealed by what we call general revelation. So that's where we're going. So next week, we're going to begin to get into the wrath of God and living under a flight path. Let's pray. Lord, we struggle because we don't even know what we want or what's right. We know that things aren't as they should be, but we don't know how to make them better. And it doesn't seem to be a satisfying answer to say, no, everything is exactly as it should be. It's just chaos. And so use your power and your technology to distract you and create a pleasant little bubble until the chaos finally kills you. Help us, Lord, to believe a better answer. Give us your Spirit. In the name of Jesus, amen.